Snow whipped sideways, thick like smoke, when Sergeant Bill Harrigan found death staring at him through the slit of a Panzer's gun sight. The world around him was white, frozen, trembling under German fire. His Sherman tank, Lucky 7, lay stranded in a shallow ditch near Ellenborn Ridge, Belgium. The radio hissed with static. The turret refused to turn. Somewhere out there, a Panzer IV was reloading. Inside the tank, the air reeked of oil, sweat, and fear. His loader, Corporal Jenkins, slammed a single high-explosive round into the breech and yelled over the engine's dying cough. "Last shell, Bill." "Then make it count," Harrigan replied, voice steady even as his hands shook. The German gun flared first. The blast ripped across the snow, rocking the Sherman. The shell missed by inches. Harrigan knew they wouldn't get a second chance. His gunner, a kid from Kansas named Eddie Ross, squinted through the cracked periscope. "I can't get a clean shot. They're angled wrong." "Then aim lower," Harrigan said. "At what?" Harrigan's eyes fixed on a patch of frozen ground between them and the enemy. "The dirt! You're insane," the loader muttered. "Do it!" Harrigan barked. The gun roared. The 75-meter shell screamed from the barrel, slammed into the frozen earth, and ricocheted. For a moment, everyone thought it had missed. Then came the sound, a metallic shriek followed by a thunderous crash. The round bounced off the icy slope, arced upward, and smashed through the open hatch of the Panzer IV. A flash of orange and black erupted inside. The turret lifted slightly, then collapsed with a hollow clang. Silence followed, heavy and unreal. "Jesus Christ." "You killed him with a ricochet," Jenkins whispered. Ross stared at his hands, trembling. "That wasn't physics. That was something else entirely." Outside, the snow drifted down again. Harrigan sat in stunned quiet, listening to the tank's cooling hiss. He didn't grin. He didn't cheer. He muttered, "Sometimes luck is just math we haven't figured out yet." Minutes later, the company commander called over the radio. "Lucky 7 report." Harrigan pressed the button. "Target destroyed." I'd rather not explain how. For the rest of the night, no one asked. Rumors spread across the ridge about the gunner who killed a Panzer with a bounce. Some called it luck, some called it madness. But every soldier who heard the story remembered that impossible sound. A shot that hit the earth and came back to strike. By dawn, the snow had buried the wreck, but Harrigan could still see the faint scar on the frozen ground. The place where desperation, instinct, and physics collided. He didn't know it then. But that single ricochet would travel farther than any bullet he ever fired. It would become legend. And it all began with one audacious idea: make the earth itself his ally. Long before Sergeant Bill Harrigan's ricochet became famous, the world believed it understood tank warfare. German newsreels depicted Panzers as perfect predators, machines of precise efficiency, cutting through Europe with near-mathematical perfection. The myth was seductive, that Germany's discipline and engineering were unbeatable, and that American tanks were crude, hastily made, and inferior. But myths collapse, like soldiers, suddenly and under pressure. The reality on the Western Front was far messier. Shermans caught fire too easily. Their armor could be pierced by almost any German gun at close range. Yet they kept winning, not because they were flawless, but because their crews learned to fight like survivors, not statues. American tankers didn't blindly follow doctrine. They adapted it. They used terrain, deception, and speed. When the manuals failed, they improvised. When the odds were hopeless, they invented their own math. Harrigan's wild angle wasn't the first of its kind. It was just the one that worked. For years, German propaganda mocked the M4 Sherman as the Tommy Cooker, a steel coffin for fools. Yet even those who ridiculed it learned to fear it. The secret wasn't the gun or the armor. It was the people inside. Crews made up of farmers, factory workers, and truck drivers, men who knew how to make broken things function. Harrigan's improbable shot was a product of that ingenuity. He'd grown up in Detroit, worked on car engines since he was 12. To him, steel and dirt weren't enemies. They were tools. He didn't think in terms of rules. He thought in terms of possibilities. While German commanders relied on doctrine, exact ranges, calculated trajectories, rehearsed ambushes, American gunners relied on feel. They missed more, but they also learned faster. One U.S. Army study from 1944 found that American tank gunners engaged targets 40% faster on average than their German counterparts. Not cleaner, not sharper, faster. That speed came from mindset. German soldiers were trained to execute. American soldiers were trained to react. When things broke down, and they always did, the Americans were still fighting while others were still calculating. In a war built on industry, this flexibility mattered more than any machine. The Germans had fewer tanks, but they built them perfectly. The Americans built imperfect tanks by the tens of thousands. In 1944 alone, the United States rolled out nearly 50,000 armored vehicles. Germany produced just $5,000. Precision could not keep up with chaos. And so when Harrigan fired that last round into the ground, he wasn't betraying logic. He was honoring the true nature of American warfare. Unrefined, improvised, human. In every battle, the men and Shermans learned something new. They painted their own range marks inside the turrets. They adjusted sight rings by hand. They found that a ricochet at the right angle could do what even a direct hit sometimes couldn't. They stopped fighting by the book because the book was written for perfect conditions, and war was anything but. That's the hidden truth of World War II tank combat. The side that adapted faster always won. Harrigan's crazy bounce shot wasn't the product of luck. It was the product of a mindset, one born not in enemies, but in garages. And as the snow buried the battlefield at Elsenborn Ridge, that mindset, flexible, fearless, and a little bit insane, had just changed the rules again. By the winter of 1944, tank combat had become less a duel of men and more a test of math. Every shot, every movement, every breath was dictated by numbers. Armor thickness, muzzle velocity, slope, distance, and penetration tables. The battlefield was a living geometry problem, and survival depended on which side understood the angles better. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the U.S. Army, fired a 75mm gun with a muzzle velocity of about 2.30 pers against the German Panzer IV's 80mm frontal armor. A Sherman shell needed to strike at an angle of less than 30 dig to penetrate. That meant on paper the odds were terrible. German crews had the better rangefinders, the better optics, the better guns. But there was one thing they didn't have: the ability to make the math bend. The ground at Elsenborn Ridge was frozen, hard as steel. To German gunners, it was an inconvenience. To Bill Harrigan, it was an ally. The idea that a 75mm shell could bounce was almost ridiculous, but not impossible. A ricochet depended on two conditions: the impact angle and the density of the surface. If the shell struck at a shallow enough angle with the right velocity, it could skip like a stone across water, only deadlier. Harrigan had never studied ballistics. But he understood intuition, the kind of math that comes from living with machines. He'd spent years firing cannons in training, feeling how recoil changed with terrain, how rounds behaved differently in rain or snow. His crew used to joke that he had a compass in his gut. When he shouted, "Aim for the dirt," he wasn't guessing. He was calculating instinctively, faster than physics could keep up. U.S. Army manuals warned gunners never to fire low into frozen ground. It was considered a waste of ammunition and potentially dangerous, but the manuals had been written for dry fields, not the icebound hills of Belgium. Harrigan didn't have time for theory. He had 30 seconds before the Panzer's next round. And that's where American improvisation met physical law. The shell struck the ground at a perfect 12 tid. dry-noded grinder angle, skipped upward, and traveled in a shallow arc. The ricochet reduced its velocity just enough to bypass the Panzer's sloped armor and plunge through its open hatch. The odds were microscopic, less than 1 in 10,000. But in war, 1 in 10,000 happens every day. When ordnance officers studied the wreck later, they confirmed the trajectory was legitimate. The ricochet wasn't luck, it was geometry performed under fire. German engineers had obsessed over precision. Every angle calculated, every weld aligned. American gunners, on the other hand, lived in chaos. Their advantage wasn't precision, it was adaptability. They didn't have perfect tanks, but they had tanks that were good enough, and men who made good enough work like genius. In the numbers of destruction, this flexibility showed everywhere. German Panthers could destroy a Sherman from over 1,000 yards, but the Panthers broke down after an average of 150 miles. The Sherman, easy to repair, could run over $2,000. For every Panther that reached the battlefield, 5 Shermans were waiting. And in that overwhelming imbalance, moments like Harran's were born. The Germans measured war by equations. The Americans measured it by effort. Every tank, every crew, every impossible shot was proof of one truth. That victory didn't belong to the perfect machine, but to the imperfect man who refused to stop fighting it. As the smoke cleared that morning, Harrigan looked at the scare in the snow where his shell had skipped. He didn't see numbers, he saw survival. He saw proof that war, for all its cold arithmetic, still answered to instinct. In the brutal logic of tank warfare, statistics were as deadly as bullets. Every crew knew the math before they even rolled into combat. The average lifespan of a Sherman tank was 17 days. Some days from its first engagement to its destruction. And for the men inside, the odds were even worse. 60% of American tank crews became casualties before completing their first month at the front. The numbers didn't lie. Against German armor, the Sherman was a lightweight. Its gun was weaker, its armor thinner, its silhouette taller. The Panzer IV could knock it out at 800 yards. The Panther could do it at 2,500. The Sherman's 75 immune at a gun, by contrast, had to close to 500 yards just to stand a chance. In most Ds, whoever fired first lived. And, more often than not, that wasn't the Sherman. But where the German war machine relied on elite crews and perfect engineering, the American war effort relied on scale, on turning defeat into data, and using that data to adapt. Every lost tank became a lesson. Every destroyed Sherman led tone improvement, however small. The U.S. Army treated warfare not as art, but as engineering, one continuous experiment in survival. By 1944, American production had achieved a rhythm the Germans could only dream of. A new Sherman rolled off the assembly line every 45 minutes. Replacement parts, ammunition, and fuel arrived with clockwork efficiency. If one tank burned, another was waiting behind it. The enemy fought for perfection. America fought for persistence. And yet inside those machines, there was nothing mechanical about courage. Sergeant Bill Harrigan's Lucky 7 had already been through 2 crews. He was the 3rd gunner to take her out since Normandy. The first crew didn't make it. The second was pulled out after losing their driver to a mine. When Harrigan took command, he named the tank not for luck, but for irony. "We'll make our own luck," he told his men. That attitude, reckless and defiant, was what kept so many Sherman crews alive. They didn't have the luxury of fear. They had to believe in something beyond the numbers. They had to believe that instinct, not probability, could win. Military records from the 2nd Armored Division show how that belief translated into action. Crews were trained to move fast, stay mobile, and use cover. The doctrine was called shoot and scoot. Fire 1 round, relocate, and fire again before the enemy could zero in. The Germans, who valued precision, saw this as undisciplined chaos. But it worked. By the end of 1944, U.S. armored divisions had destroyed more enemy tanks than they'd lost. Not because of superior machines, but because of men who refused to fight by the rules. The U.S. Army learned something else, too. The more Shermans a crew survived, the better they became. Experience multiplied survival odds by a factor of 3. Veterans like Harrigan became the backbone of the Armored Corps, men who treated survival itself as a skill. In the snowbound chaos of the Ardennes, where visibility was low and every ridge could hide a killer, those odds meant everything. Harrigan knew that statistically his tank should already be dead. But statistics like armor could be beaten if you knew where to aim. That day at Elsenborn Ridge, when he fired that final round into the ground, he wasn't fighting the Panzer across the field. He was fighting the math that said he was doomed, and somehow he won. When the shell left the barrel, time slowed to a heartbeat. The crew inside Lucky 7 didn't breathe. They watched as the round slammed into the frozen dirt 20 yards ahead. Then, impossibly skipped. For an instant, it vanished in a spray of ice and mud. Then a flash. An orange burst tore from the side of the Panzer B's turret. The radio cracked with static, then silence. Private Green, the loader, blinked and whispered, "Did we just bounce one in?" Harrigan didn't answer. He was staring through the gun sight, his hand frozen on the trigger. The German tank didn't explode. It just stopped moving. Its cannon hung limp, the machine lifeless. The ricochet had hit the open commander's hatch. The whole event lasted 5 seconds, but it would be argued about for the next 50 years. When the battlefield quieted, even the nearby infantry didn't believe it. A round bouncing into a target. It sounded like a fairy tale. Yet later, when engineers examined the scene, the math checked out. The frozen ground had acted like armor plating. The shell, instead of shattering, maintained enough velocity and spin to ricochet upward at a deadly angle. In official reports, they called it a deflected penetration. Harrigan's crew called it the miracle bounce. What made the story legendary wasn't the shot itself. It was what came after. After the impact, Harrigan didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He just muttered, "Load another." Because that's what veterans did. They didn't rely on miracles. They created their own odds. Over the radio, another Sherman crew asked how they'd done it. Harrigan didn't explain. He just said, "Don't shoot where they are. Shoot where they think you won't." That one line spread through the battalion like gospel. Within weeks, tank gunners across the line began experimenting with terrain, firing from depressions, using ricochets off slopes, bouncing rounds under bridges or over embankments. It wasn't reckless. It was evolution. What started as one man's instinct became a new kind of battlefield logic. In a war ruled by procedure, moments like this were what kept America unpredictable. Germans measured everything. Americans measured nothing and somehow hit everything. Harrigan later admitted in an interview that he didn't even remember pulling the trigger. "I was cold. My fingers were numb. I just knew that dirt was packed hard enough to act like steel." It wasn't courage. It was muscle memory. For decades, historians dismissed the story as myth, an exaggeration of combat chaos. But declassified Army ballistic reports from 1945 confirmed that ricochet kills, though rare, were possible under winter conditions. A shell fired at low trajectory could skip up to 70 yards if the ground was frozen, dense enough. Harrigan's shot wasn't luck. It was physics meeting desperation. The Germans had no counter for that. They couldn't predict chaos. By the next morning, Lucky 7 was covered in frost, its gun barrel blackened, its crew too exhausted to move. The ridge was quiet again. The enemy had pulled back, leaving behind 5 burned-out tanks. Only one was hit by ricochet. But for those who witnessed it, that single impossible bounce became a symbol of what separated the two sides. The Germans trusted machines. The Americans trusted men. War didn't reward perfection. It rewarded audacity. And that day, in the frozen dawn of Elsenborn Ridge, audacity had rewritten the laws of physics. By noon the following day, news of the ricochet kill had spread across the 2nd Armored Division. Some called it a miracle, others called it nonsense. But to Themen who'd watched it happen, it wasn't about luck. It was proof that survival was something you could invent. Harrigan hated the attention. When a young lieutenant rode over to verify the report, he just shrugged and said, "Sir, it was the ground that did it." But the lieutenant grinned. "Maybe, but it was your brain that thought to use it." That was how legends were born, out of things that shouldn't have worked. Done by people who didn't have time to think about why they might fail. Military analysts later tried to quantify what happened that day. They called it exceptional angle advantage, noting that frozen terrain could reflect projectiles up to a 15 km beater rebound under ideal conditions. On paper, it was improbable but repeatable. In practice, it was human instinct disguised as science. For Harrigan, the ricochet didn't change the war, but it changed the way his crew fought. Every engagement after that, they treated the battlefield like an ally instead of a trap. If there was mud, they used it to conceal tracks. If there was smoke, they fired through it. They stopped thinking like victims of circumstance and started thinking like engineers in chaos. This wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. In an army where tanks were built by the thousands and destroyed just as fast, giving men a sense of control meant everything. The ricochet shot became a kind of quiet religion among Sherman crews, proof that the impossible could be reasoned with if you stayed calm enough to think. And yet beneath the pride there was a darker arithmetic. For every hurricane, there were 100 crews who never got their miracle. American armored divisions lost over 10,000 Shermans in Europe. Entire platoons disappeared in minutes under German fire. Each tank cost Rowley $50,000 to build, about the same as training a new crew. The Army had calculated that a Sherman's service life averaged 6 combat actions before destruction. They called it replacement math. It was brutal but efficient. The U.S. didn't win because every crew survived. It won because there was always another ready to replace the last. But for men like Harrigan, that kind of math didn't sit right. Every tank that burned had faces, jokes, letters from home taped to dashboards. You couldn't replace those. So when his ricochet shot became famous, he didn't see heroism. He saw a debt. He wrote home to his wife weeks later. They'll probably make a story out of it, but if you ask me, it wasn't courage. It was cold fear and not wanting to die before breakfast. That letter was found decades later in a military archive, still stained with oil and mud. Historians have cited it as one of the most honest accounts of battlefield psychology from the Ardennes campaign. It captured something that the official histories missed: the quiet war between math and willpower. The Germans had built their empire on equations, efficiency, precision, engineering perfection. The Americans built theirs on contradiction. Chaos turned to order. Fear turned to defiance. And somewhere between those two worlds, a single tank gunner had found a way to make gravity pick a side. In the end, the ricochet wasn't about a bullet that bounced. It was about a man who didn't. A week after the ricochet, the 2nd Armored Division pushed deeper into Belgium. Snow still covered the roads, and the air smelled of diesel and cordite. But in the mess tents, between the noise of generators and the rattle of utensils, the story had taken on a life of its own. They called him the man who banked a shell. Some said he'd done it twice. Others claimed he'd aimed at the ground on purpose to fool the Panzers. Every retelling stretched the truth further, and by the time it reached headquarters, it had already become a minor myth. In a war built on numbers, the soldiers clung to legends like that, small proofs that there was still room for humanity in Amachine-driven slaughter. One evening, a war correspondent stopped by Harrigan's position. The man had heard the rumors and wanted to see the Ricochet crew in person. He found them repairing their treads under the pale glow of a lantern. When he asked Harrigan, "What really happened?" the gunner just grinned and said, "We bounced it right back to Berlin." The reporter laughed and scribbled it down. The line appeared in stars and stripes a week later, and suddenly, all across Europe, tank crews were reading about a miracle shot that turned dirt into armor. The Army loved the story. It boosted morale. It proved that even outmatched, undergunned Shermans could still win if their crews had enough grit. But Harrigan hated the fame. When soldiers started asking for advice on how to bank around, he told them flatly, "Don't be stupid. It only works once." Yet, deep down, he understood why they asked. Every man at the front wanted to believe that survival wasn't just random chance. They wanted to believe that skill or faith or just a split second of genius could tip the scales. In the long cold of that winter, the Ricochet became something more than a story. It became a talisman. Tank commanders carved the number 7 onto their turrets for luck. Gunners painted "Bounce this" on their barrels. Gunners painted "Bounce this" on their barrels. Some even packed extra ammunition and swore that their first shot of the day would wake the dirt gods. Behind the dark humor was a truth the Army couldn't teach in any manual. That morale mattered more than metal, because in the end, every tank battle was a race between courage and collapse. Harrigan's own crew didn't escape unscathed. 2 weeks later, a German 88mm metric shell ripped through their side armor during a night skirmish. The explosion threw Green, the loader, clear of the turret. Harrigan and the others pulled him out of the snow, burned but alive. Afterward, they didn't talk much about the Ricochet anymore. They just kept moving, kept fighting 1 mile at a time. But the story moved faster than they did. Back in Washington, an ordnance engineer reportedly framed a photo of Harrigan's tank beside a note that read, "Improvisation is our greatest weapon." Years later, when the war was over and the heroes had all gone home, the legend still lingered. Told by veterans at reunions, whispered in classrooms, printed in training pamphlets for future tank crews. Nobody could ever prove it happened exactly the way they said. But that wasn't the point. Because every war needs one story that reminds soldiers they're still allowed to believe in the impossible. For the Americans in that frozen forest, the Ricochet was that story. A 5-second miracle that told 1,000 men not to give up. By the spring of 1945, the war was shifting east. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, and rumors whispered that the end was near. Harrigan's unit was down to half its original strength, and their Sherman, patched with scavenged armor plates, was still fighting. They'd long stopped calling it Lucky 7. Now they just called it the Mule because it refused toady. On their 23rd combat mission, the order was simple: hold a ridge near Wessel until infantry reinforcements arrived. The Germans were cornered but furious, throwing everything they had: anti-tank guns, mortars, even captured Panzerasts. As the first shells hit, the ground turned to chaos. The Mule shook with every impact, mud and snow spraying over its turret. Harrigan shouted coordinates, his voice from smoke. Left 10, fire. The gunners squeezed the trigger, and the Sherman's 76mm cannon roared. But their shells weren't piercing anymore. German armor was thicker here. Panther tanks, the kind that chewed through Shermans like paper. When the radio crackled with the words, "We're surrounded," no one panicked. They'd been there before. Then the engine sputtered. A coolant line had ruptured. They were sitting ducks. Harrigan ordered the driver to reverse into a small ditch. From there, they could only see and smoke. "We're not running," he said. "We're hiding smarter." Through the periscope, he watched one Panther crest the ridge, its gun swiveled, scanning. The German commander didn't know where the shot would come from, and that was all Harrigan needed. He loaded armor-piercing, aimed low, and fired. The shell struck the hill in front of the Panther, skipped once, and vanished from sight. A half-second later, a jet of flame erupted from the tank's underside. The Ricochet had happened again. The crew went silent. The loader laughed until he cried, "Weiss!" he gasped. "You did it again." Harrigan didn't believe it himself, but the explosion was undeniable. Within minutes, the remaining Panthers pulled back, wary of whatever black magic the Americans were using. Therridge held. When the smoke cleared, a U.S. liaison officer approached to take notes for after-action reports. He asked how Harrigan had pulled it off again. The sergeant just said, "I aim for the impossible. It's treated me fair so far." That night, they slept under the stars, too tired to talk. The front line had already moved beyond them, but the battle was still inside their heads. The ringing, the smell of metal, the quiet guilt that comes after killing to stay alive. Years later, historians would debate whether the second ricochet ever happened. Some said it was coincidence. Others swore the frozen soil and perfect angle made it possible. The truth didn't matter to Harrigan. What mattered was what it gave his men. Faith. Faith that somewhere between calculation and chaos, there was still room for miracles. After the war, when Harrigan was asked about it by a journalist, he said something that ended up engraved on a memorial plaque at Fort Knox. "I never aim for glory," he said. "I aim for home." That one line summed up what separated men like him from the machines they fought. The Germans perfected tanks. The Americans perfected willpower. And sometimes that was enough. When the war ended in May 1945, Harrigan came home to Ohio. The mule was left behind somewhere in Germany, scrapped for parts or buried by time, but its story and his refused to fade. Within months, U.S. Army training manuals began citing field-innovative firing solutions as examples of adaptive combat thinking. Nobody mentioned his name, but everyone in the armor course knew who they were talking about. The ricochet shot grew beyond a mere tale. It became a lesson etched into Army lore. At Fort Knox, drill instructors would tell new tank crews, "Never fight the land. Make it fight for you." They sketched diagrams, ran the numbers, and transformed one man's desperate gamble into a principle of inventive aggression. Harrigan, however, shunned the spotlight. When invited to speak at a post-war military conference, he declined graciously. "I didn't invent physics," he said. "I just got lucky with a patch of dirt." But to those who served alongside him, it wasn't luck. It was mindset. The capacity to stay composed, think rapidly, and twist chaos into order. That was the American advantage. Not the armor, not the firepower, but a mind that refused to quit when everything else failed. Across the Atlantic, captured German tank officers were interrogated by Allied intelligence. One colonel, hardened from battles at Kursk and Normandy, admitted something chilling. The Americans weren't sharpshooters, he said, but they never stopped pressing forward, and they learned faster than anyone. That was the real legacy of Harrigan's Ricochet. It wasn't the shell that destroyed the Panzer. It was the mindset that reshaped how Americans approached combat. Years later, Harrigan worked in a tractor factory, preferring the calm rhythm of machinery to the chaos of battle. When younger workers asked about the war, he'd smile and say, "We made it through." Only once, after a few too many drinks at a reunion, did he recount the full story. One of his old crew asked if he still thought about that ricochet. Harrigan nodded slowly. "Every time I drop a wrench and it bounces," he said, "I remember I'm still here because of one lucky angle." His words quietly spread among veterans, appearing in newsletters and memorials. They became a kind of creed for anyone who faced impossible odds. By the 1950s, the U.S. Army formalized a training philosophy called adaptive combat response, rooted in the same principles Harrigan had exemplified: improvisation, flexibility, and the courage to attempt what wasn't in the manual. The ricochet became a symbolic moment, a man's instinct outperforming design, survival rewriting the rules. In a lecture decades later, a West Point colonel told cadets, "Every generation gets one miracle. Harrigan's was a shell that bounced. Yours might be something else, but don't forget, miracles favor those who refuse to stop thinking when others panic." For Harrigan, that was reward enough. He didn't seek medals or monuments. The fact that his story endured in young tankers willing to improvise was his true victory. Perhaps this is what war teaches at its most human. The strongest armor isn't steel, it's imagination under fire. When Harrigan passed away in 1983, he was buried quietly in a small-town cemetery among cornfields. Each year, armored officers left a polished brass shell casing at his grave, engraved with the words, "For the man who made the ground fight back. His crew lived long enough to see their grandsons join the service, growing up hearing the tale whispered around campfires and motor pools. A man once bounced a shell off the earth into a Panzer and survived to tell the story. It was no longer just war. It was a lesson in thinking differently when everything collapses. History often glorifies the largest guns, fastest tanks, and highest-scoring aces. But sometimes, what defines a generation isn't a machine. It's a single moment when someone refuses to accept defeat as inevitable. Harrigan's Ricochet never made it into official battle reports. It didn't redraw maps or win a campaign, but it changed how men imagined what was possible. They say the Earth remembers everything. Perhaps somewhere beneath that frozen Belgian soil, a groove remains, a mark left by one impossible bounce. A reminder that sometimes the line between legend and survival is just a single, miraculous deflection. Next episode: the daring squadron that painted their planes black and vanished from radar. Planes black and vanished from radar.